And now we come to the payoff. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to blow your freaking minds as we explore our integrated data in the MarkLogic Data Hub. Let's get started. Recall, when we started, we defined a model of how we wanted to integrate and interact with our data and connect. And here we're saying a person practices at a facility. We have provider data. So we have doctors and they practice at facilities such as hospitals and private practices. Well, we integrated our data in the Integrate tab, and when we go to Explore, the first thing we noticed is that our data looks just like our model. And here we're getting a glimpse of data inside the MarkLogic Data Hub. We have persons, and we can click on them to see their entity details on the right. And for these persons, they practice at a facility. We can see the name of the relationship and what they're related to. And as we look at these different people, by having this knowledge graph and these relationships by default in the Data Hub, we're able to then explore these relationships to discover new information. So if I right-click on Labang and I expand his practices at relationship, we find that in addition to Family Health Center, this doctor is also practicing at the Children's Institute. And this is where, hey, we can look at this, and the Children's Institute is in San Bernardino. Family Health Center is in San Jose. There's some distance between those two, but nothing questionable. But the power of relationships, the presence, the absence of, can be indicators for fraud or abuse, or people who are up to, basically some deviant practices. It becomes very, very powerful what you can do with relationships when you have these in the hub. Now, any particular piece of information we click on, like the Labang entity, if you look on the right, we have the details, the properties for our integrated data on the right. We also have a relationships tab. This gives us another way to expand the relationships. But we have an info tab, and if we go to the info tab shows us every event that's transpired on this data as it was processed in the MarkLogic Data Hub. So on the Integrate tab, when we did mapping and mastering, every time the raw data was processed, an event is captured. And this tells us 17 hours ago, it tells us essentially what took place, what user, essentially what was the step that took place, and who was the user, and what was the raw data that this was derived from. If we look at something richer like Children's Institute, we'll see a couple of different ones, because we know that we had an initial matching, but then we had a merging based on the mastering step. And every time we take an action on these, this timeline will just increase, as this information is always stored by default in the Data Hub. If we go back to Family Health Center as well, there's a bunch. So I've been working with Family Health Center, but let's look at UPMC. We look at UPMC. Now when we have a merged entity, if you look in the upper right here, for any particular entity, if we want to see what the document looks in the system, we can just click this to get the document view. And for this, we're storing this information as JSON. So we see the raw document content. Essentially, we see the raw data that came in, and in the header, we see our harmonized data. And this is how information is stored in the system. On the left, we also have all the metadata that's captured in the system, permissions, the quality, everything associated with this particular document. And we have a preview if you wanted to see a cleaner looking view of this data. Let's go back to Explore. But for entities that have been merged, like UPMC, we did that in the mastering step. We know that this is derived from a few different entities, but what are they? Right? For those, we can actually look at the merge history. And in the merge history, reading from left to right, we see the documents that were used to compose the final entity that we are now viewing in the system. And so, one of the biggest questions that comes up in the organization is, where did this data come from? And so, by having the merge history, as well as the lineage and provenance, we can look at any piece of information and know exactly where it came from in the system. Now we also have search. So we searched on UPMC, but if we wanted to search on UPMC and Pittsburgh, right, that'll probably return us the same result. But if we said not Pittsburgh, we get no results found. But you can do ands, you can do ors, you can do nots. So let's do hospital or Arkansas. And this should bring back a few different, because this is any entities that have hospital in them or Arkansas. But if we wanted and Arkansas, that'll help us whittle this down to just Mercy Hospital, right? And so anyway, you have this powerful search grammar out of the box available for searching and traversing these entities along with those relationships. You also see faceted navigation on the left. And while we're looking at the grid view, the graph view, there's also a grid view available. And in the grid view, essentially this might sometimes is an easier way to look at these. Let's get rid of this. Right, with these facets, right, we have the counts of how many of each entity are in the system. When entities are created in the system, they're placed into collections by default, and these collections are just sets of information. But here we can then use these facets to navigate and say, I only want to look at the persons. And for the persons in this grid view, I get the same information on the right. I just do not get the ability to view it as a graph, but that's why I have the graph view. Also, you'll notice we're looking at the final database. So whenever we integrate data into the MarkLogic Data Hub, raw data first comes into staging. When we define our mapping and our mastering, mapping takes that data from that raw staging database and transforms it into the harmonized entities that we look at in the final database. Smart mastering then does the merging of those entities and disambiguation of entities based on our rules in the final database as well. And while we've been looking at Explore, right, as soon as you load information as is from the Upload tab, you can immediately come to here and start looking at your raw data in staging. And for these, there is no graph because you haven't done any harmonization yet. You have the raw data, but here you can quickly take a look at your raw data to understand what you're looking at in the system, or what you're going to be working with to be doing your integration. So let's go back. So all this awesomeness, but there is one more thing. We have this wonderful graph of information of entities and their relationships, but what if we wanted to enrich this graph and have another view? What if we could have the ability to take one of the values, take our property values, and project them as nodes in the graph to uncover new connections? Well, we can do that. We go to the Connect tab, and we can add a special type of entity. This entity we're going to call a concept, because while entities are stored as objects in the system, the concept is just it's a node in the graph. And we're going to give it the name location. And we'll create this concept location, and we see it with dotted lines. Because where solid lines represent an object in the database in our model, dotted lines represent these concepts, these nodes in our graph. We can add a relationship from any entity to a concept. We'll give it a name. It has location because we name our relationships. But we can choose a property from our entity to project. And so here I see all the properties associated with facility. And I'm just going to project the city name. I'm going to save this. And now all we've done is update our model. But what we've done on the fly is update the indexes in MarkLogic to project this node, this information for us. None of the data in MarkLogic has been affected. The integrated data is still the integrated data, nothing's processed. Just the flexible indexing allows us to now take advantage of this. So now if we search on UPMC, we start to see them appear already, right? We see Mercy Hospital in San Jose, which I'm just going to search on UPMC, and we see UPMC associated with Pittsburgh. But now I can expand these concepts as well and see their relationships. And now I see all the different UPMC offices associated with Pittsburgh. And so we can do this with any piece of information, right? Allows us to visualize and traverse and expand and understand our data in new ways. And that is your whirlwind tour of Explore. We saw how we can search our integrated data, and we can query using a powerful search grammar. We saw that we have a graph view or a grid view to analyze our data. There's faceted navigation. We can expand relationships to discover entities and their connections. We get to add concepts and connect to enrich the graph view to uncover new connections and relationships. For any piece of information, we saw we could view its lineage and provenance for selected entities. We can view the merge history of entities. So we can always look at a piece of data and know exactly where it came from and what pieces of information were used to compose it when we look at the data in the Data Hub. We have the ability to unmerge entities, and for any piece of information, we can view the documents. We saw we can look at the raw data in staging and the harmonized and final. Explore is a great way to get started analyzing and validating our integrated data in MarkLogic, but we know we'll want to go further. We need a way to export that data so we can then analyze it in a BI tool, and for that, we'll look at the Export tab next.